Welcome back to California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We are joined by Doug Smith. He is the author of this book, On Democracy's Doorsteps, the inside story of how the Supreme Court brought one person, one vote to the United States. Before we talk about the book, I want to get a sense from you, sir. How did you come to write this book?
In a pretty direct way, it is actually an outgrowth of the first book I wrote, which was actually began as my doctoral dissertation, which looked at race and politics in Virginia into the mid-20th century, kind of the last generations of Jim Crow, if you will.
Right.
And in Virginia, after the Brown decision came down, the Virginia legislature decided to close schools rather than allow them to be integrated. And
so no public schools, let's just make it so they're going to have to get educated elsewhere.
Exactly. And what it ended up coming down to is there were schools in 3 different locales in the state were closed. So if federal courts ordered integration in a particular, because it was sort of done district by district, when federal courts ordered desegregation, then the governor was to close those schools rather than allow them to be integrated. And that actually did happen for about 3 months. Schools were closed and eventually reopened because parents didn't like their children not being at school. But the answer to your question is that the key vote that went through the Virginia Senate was fairly narrow, 21 to 17, and the 17 state senators who voted to keep the schools open actually represented more people than did the 21 who voted who proposed closing the schools. And so this was sort of a clear example of malapportionment, where certain areas of the state were way overrepresented, typically rural areas, and other parts of the state, especially the fastest growing urban areas, were well underrepresented.
This is not gerrymandering.
No.
This is something very different that we, in our generation, may not even realize ever existed.
It's
malapportionment.
Exactly.
What does that
and
mean?
in fact, the New York Times during the 60s, the period I'm writing about, refers to gerrymandering as the twin evil of malapportionment, because we are familiar with gerrymandering now. Malapportionment meant that districts were drawn such that people in certain parts of a state were underrepresented versus those in other parts of a state having less representation. Perfect example, California.
Talk to us about it. I just learned about California's malapportionment.
California is a fascinating example. In 1850, when California became a state, the state constitution provided for a Senate and Assembly that were both based on population. But in the early 20th century, as Los Angeles and Southern California really exploded in growth and began to catch up and then overpass San Francisco and Northern California, after the 1920 census, the legislature refused to reapportion, to redistrict based on population as required by the Constitution. And then in 1926, California voters passed a referendum which basically said that henceforward the Assembly will still be based on population, but when it comes to the state Senate, no county can have more than one state senator, and no state senator can represent more than 3 counties. So that meant that by 1960, LA County had over 6 million people with one state senator. And if you enjoy skiing up near Mammoth Mountain, Inyo, Mono, and Alpine counties, with a combined population of just over 14,000, also had just one state senator. So it was literally less than 12% of the population of California was in a position to elect a majority of the state Senate. So that's just one example, but this was happening all over the country, almost every state.
This wasn't a vestige of Jim Crow necessarily.
No, not at all. In fact, when I first got into this, because I sort of got into this through my interest in Southern history, I thought that that's what it was going to be about. It was going to be a story about white supremacy and Jim Crow. Right. And that certainly is malapportionment is a key component of Jim Crow. But in California, that had very little to do with it. In large states like Illinois, New York, there's all sorts of different competing pressures going on. It's not on its crudest level, it's sort of a rural-urban issue. Right. But what you quickly find is that there's plenty of urban, especially business interests in places like Los Angeles, that want to maintain the rural-controlled legislature because of the labor unions, because they're afraid of that apportioning, giving Los Angeles or San Francisco its precise level of power that it should have would embolden labor unions, consumer groups, these sorts of things. So they sort of figure that low taxes, low government spending is better preserved by rural government.
Your book discusses how Chief Justice Earl Warren, who is a Californian, by the way, or he was governor, he indicated that his most important decision was not Brown versus Board of Education, but these decisions relating to one person, one vote.
Right.
That's shocking.
It is shocking, and it's interesting. I've even had some correspondence with former law clerks of Warren who themselves were sort of surprised when he first said this, but then they all sort of say over time, oh, it kind of makes sense, because I think what Earl Warren was saying is that these cases fundamentally got at the governance of every state in the country, that this sort of affected the rights of every single individual, that where the segregation decisions were incredibly important. And he said, he probably would put that as the second most important decision, but that this one so clearly affected the entire political structure of the United States, from coast to coast.
And it's interesting that your book is coming out now, because this summer we are celebrating, commemorating the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Civil Rights Act.
Yep.
Next year will be the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So it's on top of mind. CNN is running an outstanding series, if I may say, called The 60s.
Right.
And I recently watched an episode about that voting rights era. It's remarkable what was going on in the 60s as it relates to the struggle for the vote.
Absolutely, and these cases, so the cases that Earl Warren referred to that actually required that all state legislative and congressional districts be apportioned according to the principle of one person, one vote, so that everyone's vote counted the same, it was weighed the same. They actually, it's a series of decisions over a couple of years, but the ultimate decisions actually come down June 15th, 1964, which was just days after the Senate ended the filibuster on the Civil Rights Act, and days before it was actually passed and then signed into law. So this is going on at exactly the same time.
And yet, in the wake of these decisions, there was a move to call for a constitutional convention.
Yes.
Our last constitutional convention was in
1780. The original one, yes, the only one.
So it's remarkable the vitriol that was surrounding these decisions. Talk to us about that push for a con-con.
Sure, yeah, no, absolutely. And this is sort of, I think, probably the most forgotten part of this whole story, of a story that's often overshadowed by Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act to begin with. As you can imagine, requiring every state legislative body and all congressional districts within a state to be equal in population hit a lot of members of Congress right hard. There were many of the most important members of Congress came from very small legislative districts. And so there was a huge uproar. There was more than 100 pieces of legislation submitted in Congress to try to overturn these decisions. Most importantly, in the Senate, there was actually an effort to pass a constitutional amendment to modify the court's decisions so that you could, in fact, have the kind of system that California had, where you could have a lower branch based on population, upper branch based on geography, the so-called federal plan. And the Supreme Court had specifically said, no, you can't do that because counties were never sovereign entities. The states, when they entered into the Constitution and gave up power in the United States Senate, were sovereign entities, but there's no applicable analogy at the state level. So you had this effort to pass a constitutional amendment, which 3 times over 3 years got more than 50 votes in the United States Senate, but never quite got the 2/3 required for a constitutional amendment. So when that failed, opponents of the Supreme Court, who were being led by Everett Dirksen, who was a very colorful Republican minority leader at the time, went on this campaign to try to call a constitutional convention, and
he got close.
He got close. Well, there's a very small clause in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution which says there's a second way to amend the Constitution, which is for the states to petition Congress for a convention. Then the convention can be held, and then the results of the convention still have to go back to the people for ratification yet again. But it would have required 34 states to call for a constitutional convention, and they got, over the course of 5 years, got 33 states to do so.
Do you know where California was?
California did not call for it because they always had that, the assembly was always based on population, so if the California Assembly would not go along with it, whereas the California Senate did repeatedly vote for it.
You mentioned the federal plan.
Yes.
Wyoming has about 500,000 people. California has 38 million people.
Right.
They have 2 U.S. senators. We have 2 U.S. senators. Does
Well,
that violate one person, one vote?
It does not, and here's why. And there's actually a great map in there that I discovered, which is where opponents of the court's decision actually released a map of what the United States Senate would look like if it were based on one person, one vote. And of course, California had 9 U.S. senators, and 5 states in the Upper Plains shared 2 senators. The answer the Supreme Court gave is that, and this is what I referred to a minute ago, is that in the original Constitutional Convention, the great compromise was that the larger states gave up a certain amount of their power in the U.S. Senate, and that they were sovereign entities that did that.
His name is Doug Smith. He is the author of this book, On Democracy's Doorstep. I'm Brad Pomerance. It's California Edition.